I was, I don't know why I'm going to tell this story really quickly.
Tell the story.
But I was
intrigued.
doing Gretchen Rubin, the author, has a new book out called Life in Five Senses. And she started her book talk by saying, I always use a microphone because you never know who in the audience can't hear. And I said, well, I have a hearing impaired daughter, so I love you because even if you think people can hear, you just don't know. So even though we could both of us could yell to you, we're going to use these microphones.
It'll save our voices.
Yes. I'm so glad you made it here. And all of you,
Yes,
thank you guys for being here.
Thank you for coming.
Wow.
This was not the easiest.
Yeah.
Oh, I see my aunt.
We're going to give some medals out.
This was not an easy night.
No, it wasn't.
Yes. And it's beautiful out.
I don't think you've written enough books. I think you need to get to work. Yeah.
Been slacking.
You've been a slacker. I want to let's just talk about this book first.
Yeah.
But one more quick story. Allison and I met in a bathroom
Yes.
at ABC. Do you want to go ahead and tell that story?
I stalked you. No, I was right out of college, like fall of 2007, and my first job, I was a freelance production assistant at ABC. So Lee and Bob are like, royalty walking the halls of ABC, and I had just read In an Instant and loved it and fell in love with your voice as a storyteller. And, we're in our cubicles, we see whatever the programming is on ABC that morning. I see you on TV, that's how I knew it was you. And then like 20 minutes later, I see you in the bathroom. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's Lee. I know she's in the building and it looks like her. And so I was like, you're Lee Woodruff. And you were like, yes, I am. And you were so amazingly cool that some like freelance production assistant accosted you in the bathroom as you're washing your hands. But why I accosted you is because we spent summers in the same really small, unlikely little town in the Adirondacks, which was like that. What are the chances? So I was like, I wasn't like, you're Lee Woodruff, I love you because you're a celebrity. I was like, I also grew up going to Silver Bay. And that was how we connected.
That sealed it. But I love that story because she hadn't yet she wasn't yet Allison Pataki. And now here she is, Allison Pataki. So let's jump in. Let's talk about the fabulous women you unearthed that most of us really weren't taught anything about because that's the way history was. So talk about how you found Margaret Fuller.
Yeah, so 3 years ago, it was May, exactly 3 years ago, I had just had my third baby, and I had a bunch of family coming in from out of town, from Chicago and elsewhere to meet the baby, and it is Memorial Day weekend, so we had all these grand plans for the Hudson Valley, all the things we were going to do, a million kids in the house, and it rained the entire weekend. So we did not set foot outside. The whole weekend was scrapped. So like new baby, a bunch of babies, nieces and nephews running rampant. By third day, everyone has terrible cabin fever. So my mother-in-law passed me this book. And the book was titled American Bloomsbury. And it was about this genius cluster in Concord, Massachusetts, in this moment in time where Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Louisa May Alcott and Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne are all living together, falling in and out of friendship, falling in and out of flirtation and lust. And it was just, I knew all the names, I knew all of their books, all of their works. I didn't know the story behind the story, that it was basically like the first season of Friends, where they're all living together, like 19th century Concord edition. And what really stunned me was that the leading lady of it all, the woman who Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to as the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center of their circle, the woman who inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne to write Hester Prynne, the woman who Louisa May Alcott considered her mentor and role model, was this woman, Margaret Fuller. And again, I knew the names of everybody else, but she was the leading lady in my mind. I thought that is the most interesting story. Not just what she did and what she wrote, what she put down on the page, but her life. Everything from Concord and beyond, New York, Paris, Rome. And I just thought, how do we not know her? How do we know all these other characters? And yet she was really the leading lady of the bunch. And so I had this feeling where I knew I had met my next book. I knew I had met my next heroine woman. I said, that's who I want to write about. That's who I have to write about.
And just to broaden it out for a little bit, because you've done so many fascinating characters, and I loved the Marjorie Merriweather Post book. That just particularly, just amount of research you did and to couple research with dialogue that you pretty much have to make up because there aren't a lot of transcripts of their lives. But so with all of the books, was it an aha moment like that where you just thought, this is it?
Yes, yeah. I explained it to my husband where I say, it's just this phenomenon like I've been bitten. The story gets its hooks in me and it becomes almost like a compulsion because with Marjorie, I researched that book for 6 years. And with Margaret, it's been 3 years. But the hope is then if readers will have me, I'll talk about it for many more years to come. So it really has to be this obsession where the historical figure that you're reading about and researching morphs into this living, breathing, talking figure that's sort of in your head, and the character comes to life in a way that I know I want to write her story.
Which is so interesting to me to think about. So you start almost excavating the facts.
Yeah, yes.
How do you start hearing her words in your head? Do you making the dialogue up? You do a 360. You bring this person to life. Talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, well, with Margaret Fuller and with really all of the books, it begins with going to the place where she lived, retracing her footsteps. So in this case, it was Concord, Massachusetts. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great sage of Concord, really only a few decades into this brand new country of America, is attracting this group of thinkers and artists to Concord, and they become known as the Transcendentalists. It becomes this movement in America, sort of a rebuttal to the Romantics in England and Europe. And so for me, it really started there with the Emerson home, because that's where Thoreau lived as a handyman. That is where Margaret stayed over the course of many years. Emerson was paying the Alcott's rent on Orchard House, which is the house we all know of from Little Women, and he helped the Hawthornes, Nathaniel Hawthorne and his new bride, move into another one of his family properties, the Old Manse. And when Thoreau moved out to the woods to live in Walden Pond, that was Emerson's property. So Emerson was really the center of it in many ways. So when Margaret plugs in with that circle, it's really when her life took off as an artist and a thinker. And so that's where the research began. But it's interesting because you go to the Emerson home, and it's pretty much preserved exactly how it was when the Emersons lived there. Their table is set for dinner. You get the sense that you could walk into Emerson's office and his inkwell is ready for him to begin writing. But Margaret's room is the gift shop. So her bed is right next to the cash register. And so everything was preserved in time, except Margaret is sort of like the forgotten missing piece here. So I spend time there. She wrote extensively about how much she loved being there, about how enriching it was for her to have all of a sudden these friendships who didn't think she was a pariah because she was a brilliant, outspoken, well-read woman, but in fact that was something that they celebrated about her. So really Concord was where it springs to life. And then it's New York, and then she moves on, but taking in as much of just sort of the raw material. And she left copious letters, she left essays, she left journals, she wrote Woman in the 19th Century, so you have hundreds of pages of her own thoughts in her own voice about what it means to be a woman in America, why women should be able to work, why women should go to school. So her voice really came to life through that, through a combination of soaking up the details of her world, but then also really reading her voice through the letters and the essays and her own notes.
And when you did that, did you go, are they in the Concord Library or somewhere in Concord?
They're in Concord. They're preserved. Like, so when she passed away, Emerson and her friends published her papers, so you can, and then she wrote many of her books in the first person, so Woman in the 19th Century, Summer on the Lakes, the memoirs and her memories of her childhood, of like her very fraught relationship with her father, who scolded her for reading trashy rags at the age of 5, which was, she snuck the complete works of Shakespeare into her room and got in trouble for reading beneath her reading level at the age of 5. But so you get her actual first-person accounting of those experiences. Her lifelong fear of water, which was true, which is pretty stunning when you see how that plays out. Her thoughts on everything from Emerson to the Hawthorne's marriage. So you have her first-person accounting on all that, which is juicy. Like, as a writer of historical fiction, the raw material that you're handed is everything you could hope for. It's like you couldn't make this stuff up if you wanted to.
So that made it fun. You had enough stuff
Totally.
there. Yeah.
Oh yeah, history's so fun.
So when I heard the title of your book, or maybe you and I talked about it, in the back of my mind somewhere, I thought early feminist.
Yes.
So
Yes, you
talk
knew,
about
yeah.
where that, but that was all I
Yeah.
knew. Like
Oh,
you,
uh-huh.
shadow character, but thought of her with Margaret Sanger, who came
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's more
But that's
than most
all I
people
had.
start from.
That's all I had.
Yeah.
So where did that
Yeah.
bloom of that
Yeah.
sort of equality piece so early in
Yes.
time come from?
So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and the earliest feminist icons that we all know the names, they all considered Margaret Fuller their founding mother. So when Margaret wrote Woman in the 19th Century, living in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, it was this revolutionary thing for her to put down on the page a written discourse on concepts like women getting jobs, or women disagreeing with their husbands, or women owning property, or women wanting to speak up for themselves and not be the gentler sex. She really put down on paper for the first time all of sort of the arguments that would form the suffragette and women's rights movement that would, obviously take many more decades to play out before women got the right to vote. But when she wrote Woman in the 19th Century, that was considered the founding document. One of her mentees that she tutored, that she led in conversations early on in her life in Boston, was a young Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so she really played a pivotal role in her life, in Louisa May Alcott's life. When Louisa May Alcott changes the name of the eldest daughter in Little Women from Anna, which is what actually the eldest daughter in her family was, to Margaret, that was a nod to her childhood heroine who was coming in and out of Concord and mingling with the Alcott family and setting such an example for Louisa May. So all of these women really looked to Margaret as their leader. And when the first gathering of the American women's rights movement happened in 1850 in Worcester, Massachusetts, that was October, they had written to Margaret, who was living in Rome at the time, to come back to America and be the president of their convention. And we won't give spoilers because we know we have mixed group reading in here and we want everyone to read the book. But Margaret did not make it back in time for the convention. Instead, the convention opened with a moment of silence in her honor. And so that, to me, spoke so loudly of just the tragic loss of her voice so young. The tragic silencing, really, of the argument that she had started. And she had these radical quotes like, "Let them be sea captains if that be their calling." She was saying women don't need to necessarily have women's roles and men have men's roles. We're not only doing a disservice to women, but we're doing a disservice to men and society as a whole to cut people off and to put them in these boxes and to limit their thinking and their freedom. So she really got the ball rolling on the conversation and on the argument, and she was viewed as a very subversive, dangerous figure in her time. She was, you could say, more than a century ahead of her time to be throwing these things out there. So you're right, early feminist considered the founding mother of the women's rights movement.
That I did not know. That's pretty cool. What was the price to pay for that among the men?
Oh, yeah. Well, it depends. If you're hanging out in Concord with Emerson and Thoreau, you're great. They will ask you to be the editor of their paper and they'll ask you to work for free for them and they'll hold you up as their muse. Emerson called her a goddess. Emerson told Hawthorne that she was the one woman in the world worth considering. Like all of these men who were sort of forward thinking and the hippie dippies of the age, the Transcendentalists, these people who are, writing poetry and seeking rapturous experiences on Walden Pond. And they all, she was great with them. But the blue-blooded sort of institutions like Harvard and the traditional press, they thought it was how do they put it? She was fraying the cords of society. She was sort of dismantling the tapestry by being a woman who was happily unmarried in her 20s and, eschewed the life of a society bride and was of the breadwinning crowd, was working, was earning a salary and living by herself. it was very radical. She was very dangerous.
But among the men, Thoreau and Emerson and all the enlightened men, was she completely equal, or was she still somewhat supposed to make the bread in the morning?
She had to earn the bread in the sense that she had a circumstance that was very different from her. She always had to pay her own way. Emerson was living in this beautiful home in Concord where he could start this new Transcendentalist movement and offer Thoreau, rent-free living upstairs, and could set Hawthorne up next door, could set Bronson Alcott up next door, because he had his dead wife's trust. He had this grand inheritance. And Hawthorne was living in the family home, and his sisters were sort of passing him food under the door as he was writing his brilliant works. And Thoreau could live as a single man in another man's household in exchange for, pruning the fruit trees and doing the yard work. Margaret always had a very material reality kind of at her back, which is that she had to pay her bills. She was the eldest child. Her father was dead at a young age. She had to provide for her mother, or she always felt the need to provide for her mother. She always had to work. She was always either a tutor or a governess or a teacher. And then she was writing. She was getting up before sunrise or writing after sundown. But she didn't have the leisure that the men of her time could have because of their circumstances. And so she had the lofty thoughts as well, but she also had a very, just hard reality in terms of the day-to-days of her life.
What surprised you about her?
Ooh, so many things. The cameos by these great characters we know. So you have her life where she's going to London and she's hanging out with Wordsworth, the poet laureate of England, as you do when you pass through London, or going to Paris and becoming fast friends with Frédéric Chopin, Georges Sand, and then going to Italy and befriending Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. So the characters really coming in and out of her life, showing that she was a connector and that she was at the center of this moment of time. But one of the really fun characters with whom she intersected was Edgar Allan Poe, because when they were in New York at the same time, let's call them frenemies. He was kind of the toast of the town, hot off the success of The Raven. She was this probably like the toast of the town, as a woman there, first female editor, working for Horace Greeley at the Tribune, and they would butt heads at these literary salons. And he said, humanity is divided into men, women, and Margaret Fuller. And it was really a backhanded barb, but also a compliment, because he had to acknowledge she existed on a plane unto her own. But he was very mean to her. He called her Margaret Fuller, and to the point of she was dangerous. He perceived her as dangerous and unlikable. But their relationship was really interesting to me. The fact that she covered Frederick Douglass and his early writings, and just all of the intersections that it's almost like she was there for that, and she knew them, and I couldn't have made it up because it would have been obscene and ridiculous, but the fact that it actually happened is what you dream of when you're writing historical fiction.
Why do you think she faded so much in history?
I think there are two sort of really sad pieces to it. I think the first is just the tragic early untimely death.
What?
Which
gave it away.
Which the prologue will touch
Okay.
on that, and then you have to figure out what happens and how it happens. But I think we can't know what she would have done had she lived through the decade of the 50s, leading up to the Civil War, leading up to really the women's rights movement gaining momentum and traction. We can't know what roles she might have played. We can only dream, and so that's tragic. But then the other piece is just that she's a woman, and all of her peers, these men were traveling the world, speaking, charging money for their speaking, charging money for their writings. She just couldn't do that. Women weren't allowed to charge for speaking, and they weren't allowed to speak in public. And she had to write under a pen name. She couldn't make it known she was a woman. So I think there are just those two pieces that you can't deny.
Was there anyone else that came up for you in looking at her, another woman in the circle, or was she truly she was the only one?
Well, she was the leading lady. When Nathaniel Hawthorne showed his wife, Sophia, the first draft of the Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne, we know that book, we know what it's about. We know how scandalous it is. Sophia Hawthorne took to bed with a migraine for the rest of the day because she knew it wasn't about her. She knew that she was not the leading lady in her husband's opus. It was that beautiful, brazen, bold brunette with whom he'd spent so many afternoons, happily walking the shores of Walden Pond with. And it was Margaret. Margaret was sort of the dynamo. But I also found Elizabeth Barrett Browning to be very interesting, and they became fast friends in Florence after Margaret survives the Roman Revolution and sparks an international scandal. They connect in Florence, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning says to Margaret in the book, no woman has sparked as much, scandal entering Florence, as since I got here, because Elizabeth also entered under very scandalous circumstances, having eloped with the poet Robert Browning and eschewed her family's plans for her as an upper-class British woman. But she says, my dear, nobody reads the books about the boring women who follow the rules. And what I loved about Margaret was that there was no barrier that she didn't see that she didn't want to break right through. Not only for herself, but for others. So first woman to study at Harvard, first female foreign news correspondent, first female war correspondent, just so many of those boundaries that she pushed. And so that, to me, was what was so compelling, was the friction and the constant, propulsive need to grow and expand and evolve. She wasn't content to just stay in Concord. She said the problem with Concord is that it's lacking in discord. She didn't want to just debate poetry and philosophy with Emerson for the rest of her days. So she was constantly moving on to bigger things and wanting to get her hands dirty in sort of the gritty work of humanity and reform and advocacy. So that, to me, is what made her the leading lady, is that she eschewed what could have been a comfortable, perfectly fine life. But she dreamed much bigger.
Who would play her in a movie?
Ooh, I love that question. I think Natalie Portman would be so great because they both went to Harvard. They are both these, there has to be, she was a petite woman, she was feminine, men thought she was beautiful, but she also had this raw kind of fierceness and this dynamism, so you have to have that strength and that charisma. I could see Natalie Portman doing that. Do you have any ideas?
I was thinking Scarlett Johansson.
Scarlett Johansson,
yeah.
also.
I don't know
just
why.
a
She's
fierce
just
woman.
Yes,
Strong.
she's fierce.
Fiery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me in Concord, Massachusetts, because that's where my parents lived for years, was how close Walden Pond is to the road, right? It felt like, oh my God, he's in the wilderness, and it's 7-Eleven's right there. Come on, you cheated. You know you went and got coffee in the morning.
He walked into town. Yeah, all the time.
I love that story.
I know. Well, wasn't it so different when you were just getting everywhere on foot and when there weren't cell phones and you could be isolated even if you were a 5-minute walk and you were on Emerson's property? You were basically in Emerson's glorified backyard.
Yeah, that was the 1980s too, before cell phones, I think.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of time. Did we start a little bit late or maybe?
You have a little bit more time.
Okay, great. Dare I ask what's next? Are you thinking about that? Are you going to take a little pause? You have just churned one book out after another, and I know how hard that is. And she has 3 beautiful little girls, and they're little, and you make all this work. You really do.
Oh man, well, our job as writers gives us flexibility, right? When we get the call that our kid has 104 fever and we have to pick them up. Well, okay, I guess.
You want to tell everybody about the egg in your hair?
Oh, I'm sure everybody wants to hear it. So I've been on book tour for the past 2 months, and literally every time I've had something big, whether it was a media hit that day or getting a flight to book tour, someone in my family has a medical crisis. So I was just regaling Lee with the lovely story of the most recent one, which was I was leaving 4 stops in Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina. I had a flight I had to be on because I had an event. And I'm taking my daughter to school, and she just starts projectile vomiting her breakfast all over me, all over the car. And I'm like, well, school's out, so I have to somehow...
Take that, Margaret Fuller. You never had to deal with that, right?
It really, Margaret would probably, see that women nowadays, in order to work and have it all, it's still a very challenging juggling act every day. But no, so this is my 10th book in 10 years. So you're right. It's been a lot. So my next one will be in 2 years. That's the plan.
Good for you. And do you know what you...
It's another woman from America, an American woman coming to the 20th century this time. And I was actually just emailing with my editor today, so I'm almost ready to share the name, but we're not quite, I'm waiting for the thumbs up. But if you follow me on social media, or if you go to my website, you can find, I'll say it first there, but she was America's first it girl. So kind of like a precursor to Marilyn Monroe, and just, this one centers around a scandal. And so it's a little bit dark, it's very sexy. It's New York City, dawn of the 20th century, kind of like a little bit before the Jazz Age, and another fascinating woman who was on the front lines of history, just leading lady material, but her name's become a footnote.
Blink twice if it was Mary Pickford.
It was not Mary
Okay.
Pickford. It was not
All right. I thought I had it, ladies.
Yeah.
And gentlemen.
But similar sort of idea.
That's a fun time in
it's
history.
very different.
Yeah.
It's different from Walden Pond.
Did you intentionally toggle back and forth? And does everybody know CC?
Yeah, I've been
was-
all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, but that also came from your own
Yes.
Hungarian roots.
Yes. No, every single woman, I've given my agent whiplash because I've been jumping centuries and continents and across oceans. But every single time it's just truly been an organic, as you said so well, aha moment. I can't believe I don't know about this woman. I want to read a historical fiction novel about this woman. It doesn't exist. So that's the one I'm going to write next. It's been a very organic, Peggy Shippen to Cece and Desiree and Marjorie and Margaret. So it's really just been following my nose, and no rhyme or reason, and totally random and totally organic, but with that just obsession, that drive.
And always
to know the
women.
story.
That's your thing.
Women, yeah.
Uncovering,
The
which I
women
love.
From history.
Yep.
Her story.
Not enough.
The women who have been sort of relegated to the shadows.
Yeah. You probably got a big treasure trove of those, frankly.
Keep my list on my phone.
Yeah.
And people give good tips. Yeah. And then some really just grip you in a way, and others are just, still on the list to revisit.
Well, it's such an amazing read. I think, would you ever want to write a novel? Just do something completely from whole cloth?
Yeah.
Or do you love the putting historical with the imagining the person?
Both. With this, I really say the history gives me the bones, and it's different each time depending on how much history is available. With Margaret Fuller or with Marjorie Post, their lives are just so well documented, especially Marjorie Post. Her home is a museum dedicated to her legacy. So there was so much there. Whereas when you go with someone like Desiree, there are gaping holes in the historical record. You're going back 300 years, different country, time of revolution, not the most information available. So in the case of Margaret or Marjorie, where there's a ton of history, they're really the life story, the characters, the dates, the starting, the ending, that's all coming directly from the history. And how I feel is it's just so good, I'd be crazy not to use it. I'd be crazy to change it. And I've just always really loved history. So for now, this is what's gripping me. But absolutely, I would like to write I would like to do more children's. I'd like to do YA. I'm not going to rule out doing a more contemporary novel, but for now, I really love the history, and that's where my imagination is really going.
And do you love the research part?
I do. I love the research part, and do a big front loading of research up front, and take in as much of the raw material as I can, and then the research continues throughout the process as things come up, as questions come up, but really at a certain point in the process, once I've sort of taken in enough and it's kind of all brewing up there, there becomes a clear moment in the process where it's okay, I'm ready to begin writing. I'm ready to begin telling myself the story, and that's really what the first draft is figuring out the story. And then the subsequent drafts, I write a lot of drafts. I don't know if you are like a drafter or some people get it right and want the sentence to be right before them. I just get it down on the page, kind of figure it out as I go, and then go back and revise. And I like the editing, sort of fine-tuning part of it as well. But that's a good thing also about the job is the research is one thing. The writing a first draft is a totally other animal. Editing is a totally different experience. Promoting or launching or, author or reader-facing events. So there's so many different pieces of the job that it never gets boring. It's whatever it is, it's constantly changing. So that's fun.
And evolving.
And
You're creating something.
Yeah. And evolving even like our industry, there was no book talk. I wasn't even on Instagram, with the first few books. And now it's totally changed in 10 books.
Sure has. And
Yeah.
it's also created more of a democratic process for other people who want to write. So
Yeah.
anybody in the audience, it used to really be a funnel with the publishing system the way it was. And now there's so many outlets, which is great.
And ways to connect with readers too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of which,
Perfect segue.
what a great segue. Let's connect with you all right now. Let's make it about your questions. And if you yell it out, I can repeat it or...
Yeah. That's such a good question. And that's what I am always wondering as a reader of historical fiction as well. I'll go to Google and I'll figure out what's true and what's not. And it's really a negotiation with each book that is different. And going back to sort of what I was saying just a few minutes ago, it's different each time because of what's available. So I will say Marjorie Post, I felt maybe the most pressure because it's such recent history. There were people present in the scenes of the book that I'm writing about. I'm writing dialogue who are still alive, who I'm thinking in the back of my head might hopefully read this book. Or her home is a museum with PhDs and scholars who dedicate every day of their lives to preserving her history and know this stuff so well. It felt like this really high bar of wanting to pass credibility and wanting to do justice to the history that's there and readily accessible and known by people. And like a really interesting story with Marjorie, a lot of the family was very vocal and reached out, social media, email, through Hillwood, the museum, to ask. And I was trying to walk this line of being respectful where I'm not writing a family-sanctioned biography. Hillwood does that. Hillwood puts out family-sanctioned biographies. I'm writing historical fiction. So I want to be, almost give a respectful distance where I'm not asking for their endorsement. I want to do it well so that if they read it, they're like, that's right. Like that could be, that works, that passes credibility. But I'm also giving myself the freedom that I'm writing historical fiction. I'm not writing, a biography. So I walked this really sort of fine line there. And Marjorie's granddaughter told me, she was like, I loved the book, but it was really awkward reading about my grandmother's sex life. But that was her only grievance. And then the Hillwood bookstore, the director of Hillwood was like, well, I had to read it to make sure it passed my test, and now they sell it in the bookstore at Hillwood, and they love it because people come for tours of the museum because they read the book. So it's like a great, historical fiction can be a gateway to history for so many people. So we have the author's note, right? That's where we can exculpate ourselves from all of our sins. So like, for instance, with this book, I don't know exactly what year Thoreau moved into the Emerson's home as the handyman. I know that for a while he was living in Concord, but was probably living with his aunts just up the street. But I know that the summer that Margaret rolls up in this book, it's documented that Thoreau was hanging out at the house because he made leather shoes for Mrs. Emerson's chickens because she didn't like that they were tearing up the garden. So I was like, okay, if I can put him there enough that summer that he was making shoes for the chickens, I could just have him live there that summer because I want him to connect with Margaret on the page sooner than maybe in fact happened. Or the Alcotts lived all over. Bronson Alcott was a hot mess. He could never pay his rent. He was constantly getting run out of town wherever they were. So they had 1 million homes in Concord. I put them at Orchard House a few years earlier than they were actually there because readers who have read Little Women or seen Little Women know Orchard House. And I'm like, why do we need to burden the reader with 1 million different Alcott homes? Let's just have them be at the beloved Alcott home that we know a few years earlier. So that's where I go in and I explain in the author's note, this is why I took those liberties. It can be questions of the timeline, just for flow, when characters meet, where characters meet. I don't know that Margaret met Hawthorne when he was living in Salem, but I wanted her to be there for that scene, so I put them there together. So that's the prerogative we have as historical fiction. And then the other piece is that we, with characters like this who are sort of larger than life, like Marjorie Post, like Margaret Fuller, there's what's known as the history, known, in the historical record, but then there's also the mythology and sort of the legend. I can't know for a fact that F. Scott Fitzgerald saw Marjorie's parties on Long Island and based, some of the parties from Gatsby off of her, but it's part of the mythology of her, so I get to put it in my book because I'm writing historical fiction. So that's where I love that sort of, we get those shades of gray, we get that wiggle room, and then we can, apologize in the author's note. And I always say, I'm not writing to purport to be like the docent of the Emerson home, but I want the docent of the Emerson home to read it and say, that was good, I enjoyed that. And so that's like what I'm trying to hit, that sweet spot of, I want it to be an enjoyable narrative, an immersive story, but honor the historical facts, have it be credible according to the historical facts. And again, why would I not? Because the historical facts are just that good. I don't need to change, I don't need to exaggerate it, so.
And you accomplish all of those things
Thank you.
in every book.
Yeah. And then it's really different each time, right? Depending on whatever you're handed, the circumstances of that woman. So I really work from home best. Whatever I'm writing, I'm sort of like having that, a playlist or music that is just vibing with that book. So I want to be in control of the music. I want to be in control of the coffee refills. I want to be, able to walk my dog. So I'm not as much of a coffee shop or a library writer. So I'm at home. I've got an at-home office. You can hear my kids screaming. Literally, they're that far away on the other side of the door. I was doing a Zoom the other day. My 3-year-old just like walks in without any clothes on and just completely crashes my Zoom. Fortunately, I feel like we've moved into a world where everybody is okay with that. So, but it's really like my office is right off my family kitchen, but when they're at school, that works just fine. It's when they're home, it's an issue. But I'll get my kids off to school, hopefully, if everybody is where they're supposed to be, which you never know. By 9, my youngest one I'm home by like 9:15. And I really am like a morning person while the coffee is pumping through my veins. And I've got that chunk of about 3 hours of concentrated time. And then I get my youngest girl at noon. And then I've got an amazing nanny who makes everything possible. So I've got another chunk of a few hours while the baby's napping, and I've got my nanny there helping. And then I get the big 2 girls at 3. And so then it's really a question of what we have going on that afternoon. If they need, they have a play date or they have dance class or whatever, I can either do more work, which is like more like admin, lighter stuff, or I'm doing stuff with the girls. But if I'm on a very tight deadline, I will try to get up a few hours earlier, like try and get up at around 5 and get a couple hours in before they are up in the morning. But it's really just like a juggling act. But the writing process is, after I've done the research, I'll have a 70-page outline, or a really thick, meaty outline, because it's the history. I'm not making it up. I'm trying to wrangle the facts. And then once I have that really meaty outline and I sort of feel like I have a grasp of the beginning, middle, and end, and really the story and the characters, then I will put the outline away, and then I'll start writing based on what I've uncovered in the research, and write drafts and drafts and drafts. And then I always have a first few early readers, like my mother-in-law. I think you always have in your head, like, who are you writing this book for? Like Stephen King calls it your ideal reader. My ideal reader is a smart, curious woman or man who is in book clubs and comes to book talks at their library. And, I'm aiming for like my mother-in-law or my college roommate or my mom. And so I'll share it with just a first few early readers. And then once I've incorporated their feedback, I'll share it with my agent. And then once I've incorporated her feedback and however much rewriting needs to happen based on that, then we'll go to, I've been with 2 editors over my career, and I've been with my editor at Random House since the CC book. So she's my, I hope I can do every book with her. So she's the first one we go to. And then hopefully she has me. Hopefully she'll have me.
Are you doing less and less rewrites as time goes on? Do you have, no?
No, I feel like it's harder each time. I don't know. I feel like you've internalized every piece of feedback, good and bad, from every Amazon review and every Goodreads review and every angry person who knows that like Thoreau wasn't living there that summer. And you just take it all in, and it's almost like the first book, you just have the luck of the innocent, right? You don't know what you're doing. So you don't know what you don't know. And then I don't feel like it gets, no, you know what, like I'll say like you refine your craft, you know what works for you in your writing, but I don't think I become less hard on myself. Yeah, I told my editor, I called her. I was like, before I sent her this book, the current work in progress, I told her, I was like, I think this is going to be the most rewrites we've ever done. So I just wanted to warn her before I hit send, so that as she was reading, she knew that I was acknowledging, because it's very complicated, because it's a scandal, and it's very sexy, and women's roles in society in the early 20th century were obviously very complicated. And so I was just like, I just really want to make sure we get this right. And so I just want you to know that I'm fully prepared. Don't go easy on me. We're going to do as many rewrites as we need to do. And I'm acknowledging that you might read this and be like, this is a hot mess. And I'm ready for any eventuality. You know, I wanted to give her that warning. That is a great question.
Is there a character who stayed with her?
Yeah, is there a character? And Megan is about to have her third baby. So what I always say is it's like your children, right? Like they're all different, and you love them all the same, and like it would be hard to pick a favorite, but they're all different, right? So I always say I wish I had like, what would Marjorie do around my wrist, just because I think Marjorie was just such a boss and just such a decent, good person. So I think about her a lot, because she'd just be the type of woman, if she was alive today, I'd want to vote for her for president. So I would want to be her friend. So I think about her a lot. And then Peggy Shippen is fascinating, because she's like this, antagonist. And then Cece is captivating and mesmerizing. And Margaret, yeah, so all of them in different ways. Yeah, when you spend that much time sort of trying to unpack the thoughts and the heart and the mind and the psychology of them. And it's an imagined version of the woman. It's totally fictional. I imagine the real woman would read this and be like, you're totally off the mark. But your version of them, you just develop like a fondness and an intimacy in different ways. Yeah. I would say I would answer like that from like two extremes. Because I've been touring the country and meeting readers at like indie bookstores and libraries all over the country in the past 2 months, I would say like truly just meeting individual readers, because something happens when you write a book that a reader connects with. It becomes this very intimate, sort of sacred bond, because the reader has a very unique experience with the words that really has nothing to do with you. Like it's how the reader connected with the book. That especially happens when with the nonfiction memoir, because it's so personal and intimate. But like a woman came up to me in Georgia a few weeks ago and shared how she had a severe handicap because of an injury she sustained as a child. And she'd never been able to read since then, and she'd never been able to focus or concentrate for decades until she started reading my books. And now she's reading again because she just connected with something in the story. And I was crying as she was telling me this, because it was just to think that these things are happening and you don't even necessarily know how your book is just interacting in the world. It's a really powerful and humbling thing. So those small moments, I would say, are among the coolest. And then like the totally opposite end of the spectrum is, and I've told you a bit about this, is the Cece books. Empress Cece spent a lot of her happiest moments riding through the English countryside as the guest of Lord Spencer in England, centuries ago, and at Althorpe, at Princess Diana's family home. And so I was invited to the Althorpe Literary Festival by Lord Spencer and stayed in Cece's bedroom, which was Princess Diana's bedroom, and had this incredibly unique experience at Althorpe Estate, where Princess Diana is buried, And that's just sort of the opposite extreme of like, wow, I get to do this because I wrote a book that someone wants to read and is, set in this location. So my husband's always like, you need to write a book that's set in Fiji, and then we'll have to go do something in Fiji. But that was really unique because I brought my daughter and I brought my husband, and of course my parents came, of course my mother-in-law. I've never had people in my family want to spend time with me so badly as that week in England. They all wanted to come on book tour for that. But that was just like a once in a lifetime experience that happened because of the book. So things like that, yeah. Oh, and I will say one other, actually. I just thought of another one, sorry. Marjorie Post built herself fabulous homes. She built Mar-a-Lago. She built the largest private yacht in the world, which I have yet to be on, but that would be another experience. Sea Cloud, it is still touring the world. But her camp in the Adirondacks, Camp Topridge, is privately owned now. I love the Adirondacks. I didn't grow up in a place like Camp Topridge, but it's owned privately, and I reached out to the family when I was researching, and they invited me to stay for the night. And it's a bunch of outbuildings because it's like a great old camp. And Marjorie's cottage, it was not a cottage, but her home is still pretty much exactly how she left it. So like you're in the Adirondacks and it's like wall-to-wall pink. She loved pink, everything, bedding, pink curtains, pink carpet. And like her grandchildren's watercolor drawings that they made for her is still on the wall. Her hairbrush with her silver hairs is still there. Her safe, no one's gotten into her safe. No one knows what's in the safe still, even the family that owns it. And so it's pretty much like I felt like I was in a museum, and any minute the security guards would be like, you can't touch that. You can't, like, this is Marjorie's furniture. If you were at Hillwood, you wouldn't touch Marjorie's furniture, but this is privately owned. So the family let me come and let me stay in Marjorie's cabin for the night. And I didn't sleep a wink, of course. And it's the Adirondacks, so it's preserved, so it's exactly as she would have seen it. When you look out over the lake and you hear the loons and you see the mist. And I woke up that morning and I just looked out at the lake and I took my coffee down, I sat by the water and I just said this prayer, like, of thanks for her life and for these women that I get to stalk and hunt and, study. And just like this gratitude I feel for their lives and this sort of like deeply humbling drive I feel to like honor their legacies and do them justice in their life stories, that these beautiful, inspiring life stories. So that morning at Topridge was another one that I would say, just that feeling of like her soul in that place, like it's as it was when she was there. It's neat.
That feels like a great place to maybe end and go to our book signing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.